We have two more goals to cover. So let's just recap. What are the goals we've discussed so far and how are they measured? What's the first one? Standard of living, and how do we measure it? GNI per capita, life expectancy, poverty rate, education rate, human development index. All right, the second goal was what? Economic growth. Okay, and how do we measure that? Real GDP per capita. Okay, what's the third one? The third one is full employment. How do we measure that? With an unemployment rate between 4 and 6.4%. Those three goals tend to go hand in hand. We tend to get economic growth, which creates jobs and increases income so that we have a higher standard of living, access to more goods and services. The fourth one was what? Stable prices. And those stable prices can often work against the other three, because when we get economic growth and full employment, we tend to get inflation. We measure stable prices by looking at the change in the consumer price index, so we look at the inflation rate. All right, so we talked about those four. What was the fifth one? The fifth one was the balance of trade, exports versus imports. When we have economic growth, we tend to get a trade, let's take that back. When we have a trade surplus, we are growing the economy. Trade deficits can cause the economy to shrink. We do know that balance of trade is tied to what's happening with exchange rates and interest rates that can impact it as well. So that brings us to 6. 6 is the equitable distribution of income. And so as we look at this particular goal, we are looking at how much income does one person in your economy have relative to another. We said one of the challenges with improving standard of living is that it looks at the access to goods and services on average. And we measure that with gross national income per capita, but there's no guarantee that everyone has access to more goods and services. It just looks at the average person. With equitable distribution of income, we are comparing the rich and the poor and how far apart are they in terms of those access to goods and services. So when we look at our equitable distribution of income, we're going to measure it with what is called the Gini coefficient. So we're going to look in a moment about where that Gini coefficient comes from. We can also represent it on a graph. Just change my color here, with what is called the Lorenz curve. So we're going to create some Lorenz curves and look at some Gini coefficients. The challenge with measuring it using a Lorenz curve is that it's hard to compare multiple economies because the graph gets so busy. So we often like to turn it into math and numbers, which is the Gini coefficient. But before we get into that, how do we get a more equitable distribution of income? And why might we want a more equitable distribution of income? So how do we achieve more equitable distribution of income? We have social welfare programs. That is, you pay taxes, and when you are on hard times, then you can receive some of that tax revenue in the form of welfare programs. So what kind of welfare programs do we have here in Canada? We have EI. So if you're unemployed, you get laid off. This helps you buy some basic goods and services during that period of time where you're not getting income. So the idea is to shorten that gap between the rich and the poor, and to make sure those who don't have a job and aren't making income can still get the basic necessities. We have disability payments like AISH. So if because of mental or physical disability you can't work, then providing payments there. So we have a number of welfare programs to help reduce that gap, and they're paid for through our taxes. So why might we do this? Why might we have what we call transfer payments? So transfer payments is when the government pays you. This is all moving around. Government pays you. So taxes, you pay the government. Transfer payments, the government pays you. Why might we want to narrow that gap between the rich and the poor? Well, because as a society, we don't want those who can't work to suffer, to die. We want to make sure that people are taken care of. If people are older age, we want to make sure they're provided for after their retirement. We think, well, what if we are laid off at some point, right? We need help getting by. So as a society, we want to make sure that people have the basic necessities. There was an experiment in Finland a couple of years ago where they looked at providing a basic income or universal income. You might have seen that as a discussion. People like Elon Musk are big supporters of universal income or basic income. The idea is that everyone gets a certain level of money just for existing so that we can all buy goods and services and take care of each other, and then you can earn additional money by working. In Finland, what they did is that if you became unemployed, what they did is they gave you EI, and even if you got a job, they continued to give you a portion of the EI. And the idea here was to see what that did in terms of helping people with mental health, with stress, with food insecurity and housing insecurity, to see if by just providing a basic level of income, it would actually have a greater impact on the economy. And while it seemed to have a great individual impact in terms of reduced stress, and people did go and get jobs and top up that income as well, so it's not like people just stayed home and took the money, what it was is very costly for a society, and so they did not continue the study. It's hard to get government funding for things. All right, so we can look at why we might want to have an equitable distribution of income. Let's look at why we might not. So the idea of this equitable distribution of income was really pushed by a guy named Karl Marx. And we know Karl Marx, he is the father of communism. And in fact, one of the basics beneath communism and socialism is the idea of creating a more equitable distribution of income. And that's because both communism and socialism came out of the Industrial Revolution when there was great inequality of wealth, when you had the really rich and the really poor. So Karl Marx is famous for the statement, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." So the idea here is that we each do what we can to contribute to the group, and we will then provide for everyone according to their needs. So we'll look after everyone, right? Great aspiration, and that's part of why we have our welfare programs, is that we want to make sure that everyone is taken care of. But let's look at the implementation and why communism isn't as popular today. Well, suppose I took the class and we decided to do from each according to his or her ability, to each according to his need. So we're going to have our midterm exam and we're going to take whatever grade you got. And if you got 100 on the test, we're going to take 20 points off of your grade because you did great, so you have a lot. And we're going to give to others according to their needs. So we'll take your grade from 100 to an 80. And if someone else got a 30 on the test, we'll raise their grade up to a 50. From each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Less disparity between the haves and the have-nots. What's the challenge? What's the downside? Well, next exam comes around. Do you study as hard? Well, you might as well be the lower grade because you'll benefit from those who do better. If you're a higher grade, then you're getting less. So the challenge, of course, is that if we all made exactly the same income, why would you put in the extra time and effort to become a doctor or a lawyer? If you can get paid the same amount for no schooling as for 6 or 8 years of schooling, why would you put in the time and the effort? And so when we look at this, everyone getting paid exactly the same amount, in reality, it hasn't worked out so well. However, we do aspire to taking care of those, and as Karl Marx said, looking after those according to their need. And so we are a bit of a compromise in between. We have government involvement. We have transfer payments, right? We take tax revenue and we use it for welfare programs like EI and AISH. So let's look at our equitable distribution of income. How much disparity do we have between the rich and the poor? And how do we compare to other countries? And so then the question becomes, do we want to be more equitable or less? An argument for more equitability would be to care for those who can't care for themselves. An argument against would be that there creates this disincentive to work, that there's not an emphasis on productivity or innovation. There are certain jobs that would never be filled because why do all of that extra effort, stress? Maybe it's not a fun job if it doesn't provide any extra incentive. All right, so let's take a look then at how we can measure that income inequality. So this is a Lorenz curve. A Lorenz curve is the graphical representation of the degree of income inequality that exists in a population. On the horizontal, we have the percentage of the population, and on the vertical, we have the percentage of income. The idea here is that the more people you have, the greater percentage of the income in the economy they have. The question becomes, is all of your income concentrated with a small percentage of the population, or is it more equally divided? So on our graph, if 20%, I'm just going to change to a different color so we can see it better. If 20% of our population has 20% of the income, and 40% of the population has 40% of the income, and 60% has 60% of the income, essentially we're saying we have 100 people, everybody has 1%. So 20% of the population, 20% of the income. 60% of the population, 60% of the income. This is perfect equality. Everybody has the exact same amount. We represent that on this graph with this 45-degree line. The other extreme, perfect inequality, says that 20% of your population has none of the money. 50% of your population has none of the money. 80% of your population has none of the money. That last 1% has all of the money. So this is the extreme of perfect inequality. 99.99% of the population has nothing. 1% has everything. So perfect inequality we represent as a horizontal line, and then you can see that vertical at the end. Okay. So we want to know for a particular economy is, are you closer to perfect equality or perfect inequality? So what we want to do is we want to be able to graph the Lorenz curve for an economy and figure out if it's closer to inequality or equality, or to graph Lorenz curves for multiple economies and see which one is closer than the other. So how would we do that? So we start by looking at where we stand. So we have here quintiles. So when we talk about quintiles, this is 20%. Okay. If you look at Stats Canada data, they have right now deciles, so that's 10% increments. This is 20%. Excuse me. Talking too much. So the lowest quintile, the poorest 20% of the population, has 7% of the income in Canada. The second poorest 20%. So this is 20% to 40% of the population. So 20% has 13% of the income. And so we keep going up in 20% population increments to see what percentage of the income they have. The highest quintile, so the 20% richest people in Canada, have 38.5% of the income. We can look at this this way as well. So here we're looking at 2014 data. In your assignment, you're going to look at more recent data and compare. So I've given you old data so that in our assignment, you can look at more recent. So we looked at the numbers here. The richest 20% have 38.5% of the income, and their after-tax income is over 100 grand. In comparison, the poorest 20% of the population have 7% of the overall income, and that amounts to about 20 grand in after-tax income in 2014. So you're going to look at more recent data. But to create a Lorenz curve, we have to convert this information here into cumulative percentages. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at our population, 0%, 20%, 40%, 60%, 80% to 100%. What percentage of the income do we have? And you should start with 0% of the population. So this is population having 0% of the income. And when we're done, all of the population should have all of the income. So we should end up here at 100% of the population having 100% of the income. So let's start with the first 20%. Those 20% poorest people in Canada have 7.2% of the income. If we look at the first 40% of the population, they have 7.2 plus 13.1% of the income. So then we have to add those two numbers together and we get 20.3. If we want to look at 60% of the population, we need to look at 3 quintiles. Remember, a quintile is 20%. So we add 7.2 plus 13.1 plus 17.7, and we get that 60% of the population has 38% of the income. And if we want to look at 80% of the population, we're going to need, quintile is 20%, so we're going to need 4 quintiles and add them together. 7.2 plus 13.1 plus 17.7 plus 23.5. If we add all that together, we get 61.5%. Okay, now what do we do with this? Now let's turn this into a Lorenz curve. So let's actually go back to our graph. And we would put our Lorenz curve on our graph here. So let's just pick a dark color. So we found that 20% of the population had, what was the number? 7.2. So here's 10. Okay, so let's turn that on. Okay, about 7.2. So we have 20% of the population and we're going across to 7.2. Find that dot there. 40% of the population was 20.3. Remember, it's that cumulative number. So here's 20. Here's 40. So we're here. Okay. And then 60% of our population was at 38. So that's here, 38. Okay. And we have 80% at 61.5. So 61.5 is about there. So if we're to draw this Lorenz curve, we're going to connect those dots. And what we would look at is how that graph compares to our perfect equality and our perfect inequality. And likely we want to compare it to another country to see if that other country, maybe it has a Lorenz curve that's here. If that's the case, then the one we just drew, which is 2014 Canada, has more equality than whatever country that one is. So we can draw our Lorenz curves and then look at which lines are closer to equality or perfect inequality. So in fact, we could repeat what we just did. We just did Canada, and we could do the exact same thing with the US for 2014. So again, we would need to add up. So for 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. Come on, stop moving. Start with 0. 20% of the population is 3.1%. To get 40%, we add 3.1 plus 8.2, which is 11.3. And then to get the next one, we'd add 14.3 to that. So that's what, 25.6. And then to get our 80%, we'd add 23.2 to that. So 25.6 plus 23.2, which gives us 48.8. And then if we add 51.2 to that, we have the 100%. Now, there may be some rounding, so you don't quite end up at 100%, but you should be at 100% on the graph. So then we can take that same information and we can put it on the Lorenz curve. So 3.1, 11.3. Okay, so if I take a different color here, so that's down here. Whoop. That's not a different color. Let's try that again. How about that one? 3.1 at 40 was 11.3, so we're down here. Got to remember what those other numbers were. 25.6 and 48.8. 25.6. And what was that? 48.8. So when you compare, if this is US 2014 and this is Canada 2014, we can see that Canada is closer to equality, US is closer to inequality. So if we compare the equitable distribution of income between Canada and the US, Canada is more equitable than the US. And that makes sense, right? We pay higher taxes in Canada and we have a more support system payments, in more transfer payments in Canada. Now, you notice on this graph, it's starting to get a little busy. What if I was to add 5 more countries to this? Right now we're looking at all kinds of lines. It's really hard to see what's going on. So what we do is we convert those Lorenz curves into what we call the Gini coefficient. Now, to actually do the Gini coefficient requires calculus. You're finding areas under a curve. We're not going to do that in this class. But you should know where the Gini coefficient comes from, and then you should know how to go get the Gini coefficient from another source and interpret it. So let's talk first about how the Gini coefficient is calculated. What we're simply looking at is the area between your Lorenz curve and perfect equality. We'll call that area A, the green one we see here. And then the area between your Lorenz curve and perfect inequality we'll call B. So we're simply looking at the ratio of the area of A and B. So the Gini coefficient is A divided by A plus B. So let's look at our two extremes. Let's look at perfect equality. So with perfect equality, here we are on this 45-degree line. And if we use our formula A over A plus B, how much space is there in terms of A? That is between your Lorenz curve and your perfect equality. Well, if we're looking at perfect equality, then the area of A is nothing because our curve is on that line. So A is nothing. And when we look at the area that is B, the area between the Lorenz curve and perfect inequality, notice that it's half of this square. So if we have the square here, it's half the box. So we have 0 plus 0.5, which is 0 divided by 0.5, which is 0. So if you see a Gini coefficient that is 0, you have perfect equality. Okay, what about perfect inequality? Well, if we have perfect inequality, then we're down here on this horizontal. And again, we're looking at A over A plus B. So now we're down here on this perfect inequality line. So the space between perfect equality and our Lorenz curve is half the box. So our A value is going to be 0.5. Okay. Now, how much is B? Well, if our Lorenz curve is on the perfect inequality line, then B, that space in between, is nothing. So now we have 0.5 divided by 0.5 plus 0, which is 0.5 divided by 0.5, which is 1. So your Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1. Sometimes, and so they don't have to deal with decimals and percentages. Well, Gini coefficient's not a percentage. It's a decimal, okay? So it ranges between 0 and 1, and sometimes you'll see it as 100 and 0 because they don't want to deal with 0.43, 0.6, because dealing with all the decimal points is a pain. So if we were to look at some Gini coefficients, we can look at what they have been over time. So the Gini coefficient in Canada in 2010 was 0.395. Okay, so notice as a number, is that closer to 0 or 1? Closer to 0, so like we saw with the Lorenz curve, it is closer to perfect equality. So you can look at what's happening over time. You can look at what's happening in one place versus another. So here we have the 2010 data for Canada was 0.395, and you can also look at specific provinces. So we can see here provinces that have lower Gini coefficients, closer to 0. These are the provinces that have more equitable distribution of income. So closer to 0, more equity, more equal. The closer to 1, the bigger the disparity, the bigger the difference between the rich and the poor. So if we look at 2010 here, we can see that BC has the biggest difference between the wealthy people in BC and the poor people in BC. We can look at across the world. So here's 2008. You can see the Gini coefficient in 2008 was 0.321 for Canada compared to that 0.325 in 2010. Gini coefficients don't change very much within countries, at least not in the short term, because again, it requires radical change in terms of taxation, in terms of welfare and transfer payments. And so we don't tend to see huge swings from year to year in countries. You can see here's 0.45 for the US, 0.47 for China. Okay, so as we saw with our Lorenz curve, the US has greater inequality than Canada. You can see here at 0.23 in 2008, Sweden had the most equality. You can see at the other end here in 2008 in South Africa, the greatest inequality between the rich and the poor. You're going to be working through an assignment where you go find more recent numbers and what countries in the world have the greatest income equality, so equivalent income, and who has the greatest income inequality, so the biggest difference between the rich and the poor. To give you just a little bit more context in terms of our Gini coefficients, so again, 1, most inequality, 0, most equality. Sometimes it's on a scale of 0 to 100. But just to give you some context in terms of like what we see here in these numbers, how that translates. In 2008, the top 1% in Canada, the richest 1%, had about 11% of the overall income. In the US, that top 1% richest people had close to 20% of the overall income, and in China was about 30% of the overall income. So a higher Gini coefficient, the greater the difference between the rich and the poor. So when it comes to income equality, equitable distribution of income, we can measure with the Gini coefficient or the Lorenz curve.